So, hi everybody, it is a pleasure to be here today. I'm Andrea Paulillo and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Chemical Engineering at UCL, University College London. And today I'm going to present some of the results of our latest research into this field. So the whole presentation and our whole study is about basically plastic tree shelters and whether or not we should use them for afforestation purposes. So looking at their environmental impacts. So let's start with the motivation behind this study really. So we all know that the UK is committed to reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And the Climate Change Committee stated that to reach this target, we really need to increase significantly woodland cover from the current 13% to a minimum of 17% and up to 19%. Now, clearly there are a number of ways to achieve that increase, and one, perhaps the most straightforward one, is that of planting seedling. And the Woodland Trust has an objective to plant around 2 billion trees to support the target I mentioned previously. And we all know that for planting seedling, the most traditional way is that of using plastic shelters. But there is a key concern from the public and from of course, the research community about the use of plastics in the environment. So that's why really the Woodland Trust came to us to basically to set up a research study trying to answer a number of questions. In particular, they wanted to understand whether the environmental impacts of using plastic shelters outweigh the environmental benefits of planting trees. They also wanted to understand which material is environmentally preferable and which is the preferable end of life. So to try and answer these questions, with of course some limitations that I'll mention in the end, So the goal of the study, before getting into methodology, so the goal of the study is has three basically main aims. So firstly, we wanted to quantify the environmental impacts of planting shelters planting trees with and without shelters. Then we wanted to understand the key environmental hotspots, so where do these environmental impacts are coming from, and therefore identify the most advantageous options. And then, of course, we wanted to support afforestation efforts by the Woodland Trust and other basically international initiatives. So, as I was saying before, to do that, we used a widely adopted methodology called life cycle assessment. It is a standardized methodology that is used for policy making, decision making by governments, industries, NGOs, and actually also us citizens. And it has two key features. It looks at the entire life cycle of a product, so from the extraction of the raw materials up to their end of life. And secondly, it covers a wide range of environmental impacts. So we not only look at climate change, we look at acidification, eutrophication, resource use, water consumption, particulate matter formation, and so on and so forth. So using the LCA framework, we basically investigated a number of potential scenarios for planting trees with and without shelters. And this is a summary of the scenarios that we looked at. For us, our base case scenario was basically a scenario where we were not using any shelters. Okay, so that's our base case. And then we had two kind of clusters of scenarios. Some scenarios that are currently applicable with current technologies, for example, and some scenarios that could be applicable in the future. So looking at the currently applicable one, we basically investigated two types of plastics, okay? Polypropylene, fossil-based one, and PLA, polylactic acid blend, which is bio-based and biodegradable. Then for us, we considered that these shelters would be recovered at the end of their life, but in the current scenario, only a part of these shelters could be recoverable due to fragmentation. So only a part of the shelters after the establishment period of the tree could be recoverable. And finally, we look at the options for the end of life, and in a currently applicable scenario, either basically we send them with the current UK waste streams, so they're either incinerated or landfilled, or basically they could be downcycled, so recycled into lower quality materials. Now for the prospective scenarios, and actually you can see, yeah, the table is partly cut. Anyway, for the prospective scenarios, we looked again at PP and PLA, but we also considered a percentage of recycled content, and there is one row which you cannot see, where it's basically a bio-based version of polypropylene. In this case, we considered that these shelters have an improved formulation so that we can recover all of them at the end of their establishment period. For the end of life, we basically considered the best technology that we have nowadays, so incineration with energy recovery, or basically the recycling of shelters into new shelters. Right, so looking at the scope, basically, as I said, LCA looks at the entire life cycle of products. So when we looked at the scenario without tree shelters, we considered the propagation of trees, which is the top row, the propagation of trees, the transportation of trees to the planting site, and the, of course, planting. In the scenario where we use shelters, we also considered the manufacture of the tree shelters, so transportation of the raw materials as well and their extraction, and we also considered basically the transportation of the shelters and the potential production of microplastic. And we also quantified that. And then the transportation of the shelters after recovery and basically their end of life. One important aspect, the results I'm going to show, they are referred to what we call the functional unit, which is our basis of calculation. And for us, the functional unit is the achievement of one tree, mature tree, past the establishment period, which is 5 years. Before getting into the results, I also want to touch upon some key assumptions that basically this table summarizes the key assumptions. But the most important aspect that I want to touch upon is the survival rate of trees. Okay, so we basically gathered the data from literature data from a number of reviews, mainly focused in the US, where basically they say that the probability of survival of a tree without using shelters is roughly 50%. So 1 in 2 trees will basically survive the 5-year establishment period. Whereas for the scenario where we use shelters, that survival rate increases to 85%. And this is very important, because when we look at our functional unit, our basis of calculation, which is the achievement of one tree surviving the establishment period, it means that when we don't use shelters, we need to plant 2 trees to achieve 1. When we use shelters, we need to plant a lower number of trees, 1.18, to achieve again the same number of trees surviving the establishment period. So let's now look at some of our results. Now this graph shows the carbon emissions, or if you want to call it the carbon footprint of the currently applicable scenarios and our base case, which is scenario 1, the first column on the left. There are 3 key messages here. Okay, so if you look at the chart, on the y-axis you have carbon emissions, x-axis you have the different scenarios. Okay, if you look at the chart, the smallest column is the first one to the left, and that is the scenario where we don't use shelters. Okay, meaning the lowest carbon emissions are found for a scenario where we plant more trees without shelters. If we look at the colors basically represent the different activities in the life cycle, and the key message here is that all the big columns, so the one where we use the scenario where we use shelters, they are dominated by a green color. That green is basically the carbon emissions for the manufacture of the shelters, meaning tree shelters generate a lot of carbon emissions. Okay? And then the third is, but do these carbon emissions outweigh the potential of trees for sequestering carbon? The answer is no. And that is basically shown in this table. This table shows the cumulative amount of CO2 that is sequestered by an average tree. Okay? After 5 years, which is the establishment period, an average tree would have sequestered 3 kilograms of CO2, which is higher than all those columns. So basically, plastic shelters and planting do not generate more carbon emissions than what they can actually sequester. So they do not outweigh the environmental benefits of trees. Now, quickly looking at the future scenarios, so we have the first column again is the scenario without shelters, and all the others are basically scenario where we use shelters. And again, you can see the similar trend. So not using shelters generate lower carbon emissions than any scenario where we use shelters. In this case, the best scenario is scenario number 9, which is 0.44, and that is a scenario where we use polypropylene-based shelter and where they are fully recovered and fully recycled. But that is still twice as much the carbon emissions as our base case. Now, we only looked at carbon emissions so far, but I mentioned that one of the key advantages of LCA is to look at a number of environmental categories. So I mentioned acidification, eutrophication, and others. So how do the different scenarios compare when we take into account all these other environmental categories? Now, this table, I don't want you to look at the numbers, shows on the first column all the environmental categories that we looked at, and the other columns are a selection of scenarios. And I want you to focus on two colors, only two colors actually, red, and the other one, yeah, you can see it, green. Green means that that scenario has the lowest impact in that category, and red the highest. The key message here is that there are clearly environmental trade-offs. So our first column is the scenario where we don't use shelters, and there are some red spots. So in some categories, for some environmental problems, like for example, freshwater eutrophication or water consumption, they actually perform very badly compared to the others. So what we did, we developed a single environmental score that basically represents the overall performance of each scenario across all environmental categories. And that's basically the ranking of the different scenarios in this single environmental score. And we can see, again, we can basically draw similar conclusions. The best scenario, again, is not using any shelter. Second best scenario is basically one of those that could be applicable in the future, where we use polypropylene-based shelters, which are fully recovered at the end of the establishment period, and they're fully recycled. And the third best is a current scenario. Again, polypropylene shelter, only partially recovered, because we can recover all of it, and downcycled. Okay? I want to touch upon two key limitations of this study that we need to be aware. First is that the survival rate of tree is a key assumption that significantly affects the results. And changing basically this survival rate might basically tip the results towards one scenario or another. And we did a comprehensive sensitivity analysis around that. And the second, which is very important, also linked to the previous presentation, is that currently the LCA methodology cannot quantify the impact of plastic pollution. We did quantify how much micro and nanoplastic could end up in the environment, but quantifying the impact on the ecosystems and on humans, we simply cannot do it because there is not enough data out there. So there is a lot of efforts that needs to be done. But if we were to consider the impact of plastic, then the scenario where we use fossil-based or non-biodegradable plastic shelters, they would have even higher environmental impact. So the scenario without using shelters would be even more beneficial. So to conclude, some key messages here. So the carbon emissions of planting trees with and without tree shelters, they are basically negligible compared to the carbon sequestration of a tree. The best, from an environmental perspective, the best scenario is basically to plant trees without tree shelters, even if we have to plant more trees. If we really need to use shelters, At the moment, and on the basis of the scenarios that we looked at, they should be polypropylene based, fully recoverable, and fully recycled. And bio-based plastics at the moment, they don't as the fossil-based one, because of a number of reasons. One of them is the feedstock that is used for making those. We are doing other works in this area. We are still working with the Woodland Trust, investigating new products, new shelters products that are coming to the market. And of course, we have other basically aims or tasks that we'll do again with the Woodland Trust, updating our model to take into account more specific data for the UK, for example, the survival rate, and looking at other protection scenarios like, for example, fencing or deer deterrent. I just wanted to quickly acknowledge the co-authors and my colleagues who helped in basically carrying out this study, which basically was done under the umbrella of the Plastic Waste Innovation Hub at UCL. And if you're really, really interested, basically our results are published in this paper, where basically that goes with the same title. There is a DOI and a QR code that hopefully should work in basically directing you to the online link. And thank you very much for your attention.